Hello, everyone. I'm Simon Zagata, a staff attorney and social media coordinator with Disability Rights Michigan. I am a white male who is 29 with short, light hair, blue eyes, and a pink collared shirt on. And I'm here with Kristen Milefchik. She is a vaccine team advocate with Disability Rights Michigan, and I will let her introduce herself.
Yes, hi, I'm Kristen. I have medium length, like chin length, brown hair with blondish streaks in it. I'm wearing a turquoise sleeveless top, and some bronzish colored earrings today. And I'm a vaccine advocate for Disability Rights Michigan. So what I do is help people that might have issues with accessing vaccines and other needed types of healthcare, get access to those services.
Cool. And we're here with Kristen today to talk a little bit about her work with the vaccine advocacy team, but also about Disability Pride Month, which is in July. We are going to try to do a series of interviews with, and Kristen, do you prefer disabled person, person with a disability? How do you prefer to be referred to?
I use identity first language for myself when referring to myself. So I am a disabled person. That's how I refer to myself.
Okay, great. Thank you. So Kristen is a disabled person, and we are going to do a series of interviews with disabled people about Disability Pride Month and what it's like to be a disabled person, what Disability Pride Month means to them, why they are proud to be a disabled person. And so Kristen is our first interview for that, and we're just here to learn her perspective. So Kristen, to start off, when you hear Disability Pride Month, what do you think of it? What's your mindset around that?
Well, the first thing I think of is we've kind of come a long way. There didn't used to be a Disability Pride Month, and I think it's really exciting that we have come that far about shifting the perspective about what disability even means, because I think that there's still some misunderstanding out there that sickness and illness is not the same as disabled. Disability and being sick are not synonymous. And I think that comes from a way of thinking in older times that disability was all about a diagnosis, a medical issue. But the fact of the matter is that disability is a natural part of diversity, and that differences in the way people think or the way people move or the way people look isn't a negative thing necessarily. There may be symptoms of certain types of medical diagnoses that are negative, like pain. I mean, that there are things we all have to deal with in life that are negative, but the whole big picture of having a disability is not all bad. In fact, it lends to having different sorts of perspectives that we wouldn't have in the world if it weren't for the existence of disability and difference in thought and difference in functioning and the way people do things. So yeah, I think it's exciting. I think it's really important that we celebrate this community and this culture, because disability is, like I said, more than a medical diagnosis. It's about the culture of people who have disabilities coming together to celebrate those differences and how they're an asset rather than a weakness.
That's really interesting, and it reminds me of something we talked about here at work last week, that change from a medical model to a more social model, and
Yes.
moving away from that medical model in some ways. And I'm glad you said what you did about different perspectives and it being part of diversity in our society. Can you just give us an idea of how being a disabled person has given you a different perspective, or some of the advantages or good things that have come from being a disabled person that other people might not think about?
Yeah, well, and disability itself is incredibly diverse. So speaking from my own personal perspective, I have a mainly physical disability, which it's made me be more resourceful, more creative. I've had to figure out how to do things and look at things in a different way to accomplish the things that I want in life. Which, it shouldn't be incredibly difficult to do that. But it has made me a more resilient person, a more creative person. I've learned how to be resourceful. I've learned how to communicate well, because it's really difficult to work in a world where it's not necessarily made for you. Without being able to communicate your needs or your vision for how you can see things being better. And I think that having that kind of perspective, and with all different types of disability, makes us people with disabilities a little more empathetic and inclusive to all people and the broader community around them. I think it's easier to put yourself in other people's shoes when you've experienced certain challenges yourself. And you hear the term universal design, for instance. You can't think of something that's been created for people with disabilities that hasn't benefited everyone, whether they have a disability or not. Because when you do something that is making the community or the world more inclusive of people with disabilities, it automatically makes things easier and more accessible for everyone. So I think that you can also think about it from the perspective of people that have mental health disabilities or have differences in the way that they think and function mentally too. Because we all have different variances of how we think and how we function mentally. And so when you address those differences in thought and the way that people function on a mental level, we're also making the world more welcoming, more inclusive, for everyone.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that, because in a previous interview I did with Derek Schmitz, they mentioned how if you do not do universal design, if you do not include people with disabilities to the fullest extent, society and communities are missing out on so many contributions because of that. Have you seen that happening, or do you see that changing at all?
I see it changing, but we still have a long way to go. I feel like the voices of people with disabilities are more present than they used to be in the mainstream. I think a lot of this comes back to representation in the media, on TV and movies. And, you know, there used to be very little about disability that was out there unless it was a tragedy, you know, and the way that the lives of people with disabilities were depicted it gave a very negative stereotype about what it means to have a disability. But the fact of the matter is we've got artists, comedians, we have inventors, we have scientists, we have every kind of person and contribution that disability was a part of and played a big part in. And I think that that is getting better, but I still think that there's a certain amount of othering that's done, where when people look at people that are not them, they tend to be more likely to make assumptions about, well, since they look different than me or they sound different than me, they must not experience X, Y, and Z, or they must not have these same issues in life that I have. And that's incorrect, because as much as we have differences, we're also all human. We also all have relationships. We all have you know, experiences that are human experiences. And so we need to be able to look at people that may look different or may sound different or function different, but not just look at them for their differences, but what we have in common.
Yeah, one thing you mentioned earlier was that obviously the disabled community is not a monolith. It's not all, there's so many different people and types of people who are disabled. And so I'm just wondering, do you see that othering in the disabled community as well? And if so, do you think it's to the same extent as in other communities? Do you have ways you think to break that down? What are your thoughts on that?
Yes, I do. I feel that in any marginalized group, that there's a certain amount of feeling that you have to compete for the resources that exist. It can be very hard to get what you need, and to feel like you're heard. And so unfortunately, some people take that approach of actually being competitive with other people that have disabilities, but it may be a different kind of disability. I see that less and less. I feel like our community is becoming more united, becoming a more united front. But I think that a lot of people that have disabilities are already isolated. And so it's hard to relate to and understand the common challenges that we have and how we could succeed when we work together if you have limited contact with other people that have disabilities. And so I think that that's been changing with you know, the technological advances that we have with communication, and how people are able to connect on social media and online. A lot of people have found kind of their identity as a person with a disability in these sorts of platforms. And that's the great part about it, is people being able to find each other, talk to each other. But it's something that it still needs work. And I think that the outside world still sees people with disabilities as a looking a certain kind of way, instead of understanding how incredibly huge and diverse this community is. As I think that there are a lot of types of disabilities that aren't even necessarily seen as disabilities, which is not good for those people, because it's blocking them from their access to certain rights that they have as a person with a disability, and that sense of community and collective advocacy that they could have as a part of the disability community. So yeah, I think one of the most important pieces of advocacy for the disability community is coming together and embracing the diversity of it.
That makes a lot of sense. And can you tell us a little bit about, you mentioned social media. Can you tell us about your own journey to find that community in your life?
Well, yes, I actually, I didn't really have any friends that had disabilities until I was a teenager. I was 15, I think, 14, when I first went to Muscular Dystrophy Association summer camp. And I was forced to do that. I was forced to do that by my parents.
Like any teenager.
Yeah. Well, and it's funny because I experienced what they call internal ableism. You know, I was so resistant to be seen as someone who was disabled, because I wanted to fit in, and I saw, you know, how people with disabilities were treated in a negative sense, like there was something wrong with them or they needed to be fixed. And so I didn't want to embrace that part of who I was. But going to that camp completely changed everything about how I thought about disabilities, because when I went there, I met people that I had so much in common with, and we had fun together. And it was the first time that I experienced, you know, that sense of community with, without having to hide part of who I was. And the common challenges that I experienced, you know, being able to be open about that was huge for me. And it changed the trajectory of the rest of my life. And so then I ran for, the next big thing I did was running for the Miss Wheelchair Michigan pageant. And I actually got to speak about the issue that was really important to me at that time, which was, and still is to this day, about people needing to have a right to adequate in-home support. So home and community-based care as a civil right was my platform. And I got to meet all kinds of other amazing women across the country in that pageant, and about their platforms and the things that matter to them. And so as I got older, my network of people with disabilities kept growing. And then, you know, the social media boom just opened that up to, you know, other people that I knew, their connections of other people with disabilities. And it just grew. And there's a lot of people that interact on social media that are kind of spokespeople for the disability community, because they're very involved in activism and they're very involved in disability pride, and shifting that perspective about what disability means. So that's the positive side. Of course, there's still on social media, a lot of people that are they'd rather listen to perspectives of people that don't have disabilities about what disability is than the people that actually have them. And I think that's always going to be a thing with social media, but still, it's a great way to bring people together.
Yeah, you hear a lot of people saying to athletes stick to sports, but I've never heard anybody say to an abled person stick to being abled. Maybe we should make that a thing and try and shift the the conversation to centering on people with disabilities.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea.
You said the Miss, is it Miss Wheelchair Michigan?
Yes.
You and I have talked about that a little bit before, and I didn't know it existed until meeting you. What is it? When is it? What was your experience like with that?
Well, obviously, all pageants say they're not just a beauty pageant, and it doesn't have anything to do with beauty. It has nothing to do with physical looks. But this is particularly true of Miss Wheelchair America and Miss Wheelchair Michigan. You're not expected to dress up in any clothing or whatever. You basically pick an issue that you want to be your platform. You do a speech. It's a competition where all the people that are entering the pageant do a 2-minute timed speech in front of a panel of judges about their platform. And they are also, while they're going through the day leading up to that final speech, they get interviewed by a panel of experts about things that involve disability that are important in the community and to the rest of the general public. And you're assessed on how you answer those questions. You're assessed on your ability to communicate. And then when you go, if you win the state pageant, you get to compete in the national level pageant, so against all the title holders of the other states. And it's a competition, yes, but it doesn't feel like that when you actually do it, because you get to meet people that are all advocating for things that are important to the disability community. So it's an amazing experience, and it takes place, I want to say it's November of every year in Michigan. It's not always the same date every year, but it was an in-person event. I think the last couple have been virtual because of COVID, but the event itself, anybody can come and watch the speeches. But the people that are competing in it also get to attend workshops to learn about communication skills and disability history and all kinds of cool things to enhance the experience, so that it's not just about what you're putting out there, but also what you're learning in the process. So,
with all those different people from different parts of the US or different parts of Michigan, it seems like it would be a great opportunity to learn what your platform was, home and community-based services and adequate supports for that. And I'll ask you about that in a minute, but do you remember what some of the other platforms were when you were competing?
Yes, well, one that really stands out in my mind that I talk about a lot was at the national competition, the woman who ended up winning Miss Wheelchair America, she was someone who had I think it was cerebral palsy, a form of cerebral palsy. And she had a PhD. She was a professor. And she was married to a man who was an engineer. But she couldn't have her own children. And she tried to adapt, but she was turned down several times. And in court was the person that was from the state that was prosecuting said that she did not have the ability mentally to be a parent. And he made this assumption because of her speech, because she sounded different. When obviously looking at any of her credentials, you know, she proved that her ability to parent was there. And so her platform was about increasing the rights of disabled parents to be able to adapt. And also, you know, parents that had their own children not having their rights taken away, because unfortunately that's something that happens a lot when people make assumptions about a person's ability to be a parent and having a disability. I'm a mother, and I know that I've had a lot of people, especially when my daughter was very young, kind of look at me kind of funny and ask me questions about, like, why would you decide to have a kid? And assuming that I couldn't do what was necessary to take care of my own child. And, you know, obviously parenting is difficult for anyone, and there may be assistance needed with certain types of childcare, you know, not types of childcare, but different aspects of childcare. But that's no different than somebody that doesn't have a disability. We all need assistance with things sometimes, but in no way has my daughter or Alette's Miss Wheelchair America from 2015 daughter been negatively affected by us having our disabilities. So yeah, and that's just one of them. So I could talk all day about the different platforms that people had, and it really opened my eyes to some of the different challenges, because like me, I have a physical disability, but I don't communicate much differently verbally than someone that does not have a disability. So it never occurred to me how much somebody might be misjudged just by their speech. So it's a very enlightening experience.
Yeah, I can see how that would stick with you right away as a mother yourself or any parent, and just nobody, it's a thing we're taught not to do to anyone, is give parenting unsolicited parenting advice is this huge taboo. Mm-hmm. And so to have somebody who's doesn't know you or is just making small talk in a small moment feel comfortable breaching that taboo and saying really hurtful, offensive things, just I think highlights some of the differences in the lived experience there.
Yeah, and it goes back to that othering thing. You know, people have the tendency to say, well, if it looks different than how I experience life or I do things, then there must be something wrong. And really got to get away from that style of thinking, because it doesn't just apply for people with disabilities, but other marginalized groups that have different cultures, different ways of doing things, different styles of, living their life than maybe, you do or I do. So it's just, I think that half of the battle with ableism is just accepting that people are different, that diversity exists, and that doesn't mean it's a negative thing if somebody is not just like you. Simple as that.
Simple as that. Everybody listen to Kristen, and we're gonna figure it out. If only, just broadcast it. So that was one of the other platforms, and your platform during that competition or pageant was home community-based services. That's something we work on a lot at our organization. Can you just tell us about that platform and what the concerns are about home community-based services, what your view is on what we need to do better?
Sure. Well, there are a lot of people that are just like me that are living in nursing homes or other congregate living environments because they don't get an adequate amount of support to live in their own home. And I think that's completely inhumane and inappropriate. We know that people living in congregate settings often leads to instances of neglect and abuse. And, it may not always even be intentional, but you can't mass produce care. And in congregate settings, restrictive living environments like that, there's only so many people, so much, one-on-one care that's provided, that people are often limited in the most basic everyday ways and for the most basic needs, not to mention being able to get out in the community and interact socially in their community. And it's just heartbreaking to me that there's so many people that with an appropriate level of care, appropriate amount of in-home support, could be living fairly independently and with autonomy and dignity, and they don't get that just because of a financial cap that is put on the amount of services that they're allowed to get. It should not be ever about the money, because this is a human right. It's a human right for people to be able to live their lives. You talk about the right to the pursuit of happiness and to life. I mean, the life expectancy of people in nursing homes as opposed to people that live in their own homes is greatly diminished just by being in that environment. Because their most basic rights, their privacy, their autonomy, that's all stripped away in those environments. And that doesn't necessarily mean that the people that work in those environments are bad people. It's just that they're trying to mass produce something that can't be mass produced. And so my platform was that adequate home and community-based care for people to be able to live in their own homes as opposed to restricted living environments needs to be a civil right. And, we do have laws that say we're supposed to prioritize home and community-based care, but there's still caps on the amount of services that people can receive. And I live in one of the good states. Michigan is supposed to be one of the best for the levels of home and community-based services that people can get in this state. But it varies from state to state. And even in Michigan, the funding for these programs and supports is way too short. And a lot of that money is funneled still into nursing homes and these other types of environments because it's an industry. They have lobbyists, So that's what we're fighting, and I'm still fighting it. And I'm sure you know this because you're involved with a lot of that in your work. But it's an ongoing issue, and it's gotten better. There is more home and community-based services than there was 10 years ago. But it's still far from enough. And as we saw during the pandemic, what the results of that can be for the people that are basically warehoused like that are devastating. So
yeah, it's hard to stomach putting monetary considerations above people's independence. I mean, independence is, for better or worse, one of the main values of United States society. And so it's hard to square that with, well, there are a lot of people who could and should be independent, but are not because we've decided not to spend the money.
Mm-hmm. And I think that a lot of that has to do with people believing that independence for somebody with a disability is not achievable. No matter what, they think that they're not independent unless you can do everything by yourself, right? But I live independently with assistance. I have assistance to get up in the morning, help me get ready physically for my day. I have somebody that has to drive me places when I want to go somewhere, but I'm still making my own decisions. I'm still working. I still get to play the way I want. I get to live the way I want, Mm-hmm. And that is what independence means. It doesn't mean that you have to do everything by yourself. Everybody needs assistance.
If independence meant we had to do everything by ourselves, we would all be living like participants on the show Alone, like out in the woods trying to chop down trees. And
right.
There are obviously differences in levels of assistance or how we exercise our independence, but the definition cannot be doesn't need help with anything, because then nobody's independent.
No one is. And it's not people that are done living their life that end up in nursing homes, contrary to, I think, what a lot of people believe about it, that there are people that are nearing the end and they're not really doing anything anymore and they don't care. Even for older persons, a lot of them still would have a lot more life to give and still be able to be quite active and quite independent if they were not forced into that type of a living environment because they can't get the care that they need in their own home. So definitely.
And no one likes to think about having those choices taken away from them.
No. There's been a lot of exposés that have been done about nursing home care and long-term care facilities and how poor the conditions are, and that they're not just older people either that end up. A lot of people don't realize that sometimes children are placed in these types of facilities, but it's still an issue that we've kind of gotten used to it, and it's kind of just the go-to, solution that we have in this society, is that if it costs a lot of money for them to live independently, then this is the better solution. And it's kind of silly because it's actually not cheaper anyway. When you when you look at the cost of putting somebody in one of these facilities, it costs way more than it does to provide one-to-one care at home. So,
and then, like you mentioned earlier, we also have, I mean, it was put in very stark terms with the pandemic, and is still being put in those stark terms, some increased public health dangers. And I know with the vaccine advocacy team, you work a lot on getting people in those facilities and in those settings access to vaccines, and just communities in general access. But can you tell us a little bit more about that work, why it's important to you?
yes. So I was working at a different job when the pandemic hit, and it was a job I wasn't going to be able to do anymore because of in-person, requirements. And so this pandemic was really hard for me because while my condition is not something that's classified as making me immunocompromised, I am at higher risk of respiratory infections. And so even being able to leave my house to do the basic things like grocery shopping was out of the question for me before there was a vaccine. And then when there was a vaccine, people with disabilities under the age of 65 were not prioritized in the rollout. And fortunately, to a lot of disability rights organizations coming together, Detroit was one of the first cities in the country that prioritized people with disabilities to get the vaccine. And that was based on, evidence that showed like people with developmental disabilities, for instance, being 11 times more likely to become severely ill or die from COVID-19 if it was contracted. So that was some amazing advocacy work that allowed people with disabilities to get vaccinated sooner. And it was a huge relief to me when that became available to me. But then my work here, when I got this job, has brought to light that even now that the vaccine is available, highly promoted, and I mean, you even have retail stores and pharmacies and pop-up clinics and all of these things that are being done to make it widely available. There's still a lot of people, many of whom do live in congregate living settings like adult foster care homes, who have not had access to the vaccines because there's a caregiving crisis. And a lot of these homes are understaffed, and getting people out of their home means that you have to have enough staff to get everybody out at once, because nobody can be left home alone. And there's all kinds of challenges. Transportation, there's not enough public transportation available, and not all places have their own vehicles to transport people. And these are all issues: lack of caregiving support, lack of public transportation or other transportation modes that are accessible and affordable that I've experienced in my own life. So we know that it's out there and we are finding people, but it's the people that are the most isolated and least connected that are often the people that don't have access. So again, this all comes back to providing people with the amount of support that they need to not be cut off like that, to have the assistance that they need, that they're able to get out of their own homes if they need a service. But there are also people that, are, for better or for worse, not able to leave their homes. Mm-hmm. And we're also finding some of them and have been able to help people who are quote unquote homebound. But a lot of the challenges for people that aren't able to get access to vaccines are not a medical challenge as much as a social environmental challenge. Mm-hmm. Lack of caregiving supports, lack of accessible transportation. There's not enough accessible housing. A lot of times people end up in a house that they can't easily get in and out of because it's all that's available that they can afford. So yeah, I think it's over 600 people now that we've helped get access to vaccines and have been able to bring them to their homes. But I hope that this work also helps prove that we need to do more to ensure that people aren't cut off from the most basic healthcare services that they need.
I think about it like a sidewalk with cracks in it, and the cracks were always there, but then COVID-19 came and expanded them and put a spotlight on them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the amount of people that died of COVID-19 and then the proportion of those people that were people that did live in those nursing homes and congregate living environments shows what a huge public health crisis these environments are. I mean, and that's going to be the case in any type of pandemic or contagious virus, but that doesn't mean that there weren't already public health crises going on before there was a pandemic. And that just has to do with the lack of adequate care and people being unsafe to begin with because of it.
Yeah, agreed. And so we're talking a little bit or a lot of bit about lessons we can hopefully learn from the pandemic. Switching gears a little bit to Disability Pride Month, what lessons or things do you hope people learn from Disability Pride Month that they can take forward and make it more than just a month to think about these things?
Well, I hope that people are exposed to a lot of interviews, a lot of articles, a lot of people with disabilities talking about their experiences and talking about what it means to them to be disabled. And it shifts the perspective. I think that's the constant mission I am on is in my personal life, is just to shift the perspective of what disability is, and help some people to realize that we're barely even a minority. I mean, if you talk about 26% of the population having some kind of disability, it kind of sounds funny to even call us a minority. We're marginalized, but that's mostly due to the attitudes about what disability is. And so I hope that we continue to see that exposure, start to see more representation of disability in movies and in film and on social media and gaming. I mean, there's all kinds of ways that people are getting their voices out there, and that disability stops being othered. We start to realize that it's just a natural part of diversity. It's never going to go away. We don't really want it to go away because, like, you know, what would this world be without ASL, without people with autism and the diversity that different types of disabilities bring? I don't think that it should ever be about trying to fix people. It needs to be about fixing the way we think about people.
Fix access, fix viewpoints, don't fix people.
Right.
And you were just talking about these different things the world would be so different without, and I think that's so, to me, that's a huge part of what I'm going to take from Disability Pride Month and just the work I do here in general. But I was just wondering what makes you proud to be a disabled person?
Well, a lot of it has to do with being part of an incredible community of leaders and activists and comedians and actors and, you know, actresses and just I'm part of a community that has displayed incredible strength and perseverance and creativity and what's not to be proud of. I mean, and there are a lot of people that have disabilities that are celebrated, you know, historical leaders, civil rights activists, etc., that have disabilities. You know, it's not even talked about that much, but I know it to be true, and I know how many incredible people there are out there with disabilities, and it's not so much why I'm proud, as much as why shouldn't I be? You know, I think that the first thing that people with disabilities have to do is defend themselves as having it, like saying that it's not bad to have a disability, and they're constantly having to do that. And it's not so much that it makes you special to have a disability as much as there's nothing to be ashamed of. We're just people, and we've got as many skills and talents and unique abilities as the rest of the people out there that don't have disabilities. So it's not to be proud of.
Yeah, and correct me if I'm wrong, but just showing that internalized confidence and self-worth to everybody else and saying, yeah, here it is.
Yeah, and I think that even people that don't have disabilities but have other things that they perceive as being different, or that people may be critical of, or you know, things that they're sensitive about themselves, when they see people like us, like me, celebrating our differences, I think that makes everyone else also feel a little more comfortable with their differences and what makes them unique. And so, you know, it's also about bringing everybody up to celebrate, who they are, and not hiding any one part of themselves, just because it may look different than whoever the next door neighbor or whoever is. So
a rising tide lifts all boats, as they say. Well,
yeah.
Kristen, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me, and I will talk with you about work stuff soon, I'm sure.
Like, yes, I'm sure we will. And thank you for asking me to do this, because it's been my pleasure. I love talking about disability pride.
Great. Thanks, Kristen.